Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one we have several developments in the eastern section of the front line. Starting out in the Kupyansk direction, the Russians have managed to capture a significant portion of the settlement of Kruhlyakivka. The Russians have managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses following their foothold within the settlement to reach the central parts of it and the western outskirts of it, where fighting is taking place over the final area in between the Oskil river line and the settlement itself. At the same time, there is a portion of the Ukrainian forces which has now been squeezed in between the Oskil river line to the west, the Pishane river line to the north, and the Russian positions to the east and south. This would mean that the Ukrainian forces here in this area would be encircled unless there is some sort of crossing still available for the Ukrainians in the northern direction, where they can withdraw to Kruhlyakivka. In either case, it seems that the Russians are currently in a position where they are likely to capture the entirety of Kruhlyakivka and gain control over the crossing between it and Senkove. This would mean that the Russians would have gained physical control over a crossing over the Oskil river line and a physical cut off of the Kupyansk section of the eastern part of the Oskil river line and the remaining parts. This means that the Russians can focus a large portion of their forces to gain control over the eastern part of the Oskil river line and launch a comprehensive offensive operation in this direction, or potentially launch a very daring operation to cross over the Oskil river line and hit the rear positions of the Ukrainians. Now, this is a very interesting thought, because if we take a look at the force disparity of Ukrainian forces, we see that the main force of the Ukrainians who are actually fighting at the front line, whether it is stormtroopers, whether it is infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, the majority of these frontline units are on the eastern bank of the Oskil river line. They are located in the eastern parts of Kupyansk, in Borova, and so on. While the main force on the western bank of the Oskil river line are FPV drone operators, they are artillery operators, they are long-range units. Naturally, there would be a section of the forces that are relocated to this direction to prevent such an operation by the Russians. But it also means that if the Russians do launch such an operation and they succeed, they would be able to wreak havoc on Ukrainian rear point positions, which are weak to direct battles, and would be forced to withdraw from the front line, which would significantly weaken the defensive capabilities of the Ukrainian forces in the area. And this also points us to another thing, which is that in the storming of Kruhlyakivka, the Russians have lost a lot of armored vehicles. According to some footage, the Russians lost approximately 12 armored vehicles, both armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks, in the storming of Kruhlyakivka. The video also claims a lot of infantry losses, but there's no evidence for that in the footage. This is considering if all of the vehicles were destroyed, including the personnel and crew, then that number would be as high as they claim, about 50 casualties. However, we've seen from a lot of footage this past year that the majority of the time, both sides, they survive. The FPV drones have enough payload to disable vehicles. It does not have enough payload to get rid of their personnel, and they typically survive unless artillery is followed up or other FPV drones are followed up. And this also brings us to another point, which is the difference between offense and defense, especially in the terrain that is Ukraine. We'll move to another section of the front line, which has seen much less success for the Russians, which is the battle to enter Torske. Yes, this battle is taking place again, and yes, the Russians are having difficulties again. And I have a very simple explanation for why it is difficult for the Russians to enter Torske. If we take a look at the terrain here in this section of the front line, we have to look at three different parts. We have to look at the open fields, we have to look at the forest lines, and we have to look at the settlements. First off, the terrain here is very similar between the eastern and western parts. Liman to the west has a 31-kilometer range to the center of Kreminna in the east. About a third of the distance between the two settlements is the distance between Liman and Torske, around 12 kilometers, while the distance between Kreminna and Torske is about 18 kilometers. So the majority of the distance is between Kreminna and Torske. And we also see that the distance between Kreminna and Torske, there is the Serbrianki forest area, and then there is the open road and open fields in between the two settlements. This is likely the distance which the Russians have to cover to enter Torske, about 15 kilometers. Now, something very interesting is the range of FPV drones. They range somewhere between 5 to 20 kilometers, but this is depending on a lot of modifications. The vast majority only have a range of 5 kilometers. The FPV drone operators operating in Torske would have a 5-kilometer range, which is just to the first 45 positions that the Russians have available in these open fields. That is the distance in which FPV drone operators who reside in Torske can operate their drones. Meanwhile, the Russians, where would their FPV drone operators operate from? They could operate from Kreminna. That is so far away from the front line that they are completely useless. What about the forest areas? They can live in the forest patches and operate from there. And again, this is far from the front line. They cannot have any effect on their offensive operations. They would have to advance in the southern forest areas until they get close enough. And even in that case that they advance in these southern areas, we have a lot of footage from the Serbrianki area, forest area from last year that shows that the area is generally completely destroyed from burns, from massive fires, from so much fighting that there's no cover virtually in these forest areas either way. That means the only places they can operate is in the forest lines, and that is too risky when they are so deep and close to Ukrainian positions who can fly FPV drones around the clock and cover these forest lines. Therefore, the Russians will have to rely on everything except for FPV drones, while the Ukrainians can freely use the FPV drones not just from Torske, but also from Zarishne further back towards the outskirts of the settlement. Then you can argue, well, Russia is lucky enough to have a buttload of artillery shells and artillery operators, MLRS strikes and so on that have way more range than 5 kilometers. Pretty much everything can shoot within 15-kilometer range. That is just outside the range from Kreminna. If you go to the outskirts, okay, yeah, you can reach Torske. However, something else to notice is, well, the majority of the operators can reach 30 kilometers, 35 kilometers. The MLR strikes can reach 70, 75 kilometers. You can hit anywhere across this area. But the question is also exactly where are you going to be striking, because you need coordinates, you need reconnaissance information, you need so much more information to be able to accurately strike the other side's positions. The Ukrainians have plenty of FPV drones. They have real-time footage on where the targets are. The Russians do not have that if they do not have drone operators operating in these areas. So these vehicles are practically on their own, and they'll have some pre-coordinate strikes on the settlement, but generally there's no significant reconnaissance and FPV drone coverage to support their offensive operations. A solution to this for the Russians would be to gradually advance from the northern direction to the south, where between every single settlement it is less than 5 kilometers of distance. This will allow the Russians to slowly advance along and eventually to capture Kruhlyakivka, where the outskirts of Torske would be within reach. So a gradual advance by the Russians along the Sebes river line will eventually reach the settlement of Torske. And this is why I really question why the Russians are storming Torske yet again, when there is an opportunity that just solves itself by going the way that they have been going for the past few months. And this is where they have seen a lot more success, because they're able to hide FPV operators different areas. There's no ability for the Ukrainians to have a significant concentration of FPV drone operators or troops in general in these settlements north of Torske, where Torske and Zarishne are both mid-sized settlements, and they are within close proximity to Liman, which is a city. The defensive capabilities of the Ukrainian forces within Torske is just significantly stronger than in the north, and it can be significantly weakened if the Russians advance through the northern parts. So in the end, what we have to look at is exactly that. What sort of operations, what sort of tactics, what sort of operational decisions are being taken to determine what exactly is happening. And currently what we're seeing is that there is a twofold operation by the Russians, both this, which I just mentioned, slowly advancing from the north, but also this surprise attack towards Torske, possibly simply to catch the Ukrainians off guard, but the Ukrainians were prepared, and so the reports of the Russians gaining a foothold within Torske or even breaking through to the central parts is not true. The Russians have failed in yet another storming towards Torske. Instead, what they would succeed with is continuing what they have been doing over the past few months. And they've also done similar things in Encircled and here in the Peshana direction. The Russians were in a very difficult position. However, they took the opportunity to launch these operations in a very smart way, which was to fight between Peshana and Kruhlyakivka. And if we take a look at it, there is about an equal distance between the two settlements, where the Ukrainians would only have a 5-kilometer range from Kruhlyakivka, Kupyansk, but there is a lot of cover of forest lines. There's not been a lot of fighting, so the forests actually provide cover, and just taking advantage of the vehicles, giving them protection, they stormed these positions where the Ukrainians really couldn't have too many frontline positions because they would be overwhelmed. They had to go further back, and this limited the range of their offensive and defensive capabilities, and therefore the Russians slowly gained ground towards Kruhlyakivka. Possibly the Russians wanted to repeat that with Torske, but it is simply different situations, and putting the same input would not give the same results. Now, moving on to the Donetsk region, we see that the Russians have advanced in the direction of Vostyshenka, where they've managed to capture this fortified position here southeast of the settlement, which is a significant fortified position of the Ukrainians, and this could point towards the Russians' restarting offensive operations towards the intersection between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, which points towards the siege of Pokrovsk being near. The reason for this is that in the case of a siege of Pokrovsk, it is not necessary only to cut off this intersection to limit the supplies between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, but also to prevent the Ukrainians from sending reinforcements from Konstantinivka towards Pokrovsk. Cutting off this intersection limits the Ukrainian ability to quickly respond to situational differences and operations that take place to hit the Ukrainian defensive operations. So in case the Russians launch an operation towards Pokrovsk, attacking the flanks or storming it directly towards Mirnorod, then the Ukrainians would be able to send reinforcements from Konstantinivka to deal with this offensive operation. If that is cut off, then they would have to go around and their approach would be limited. The Russians would have a stronger flank to defend themselves in case they storm some of these positions. So generally, it would significantly improve the Russian positions and maneuverability, and limits the Ukrainian capabilities and maneuverability. To the south, the Russians have closed the pocket further, leaving only a small portion left within Ukrainian hands, and fighting has reached Soriane as Russians start storming the settlement. So we see that in the gray zone now. The Russians are here looking to not just gain control of the remaining parts of the pocket here northwest of Krasnoyarivka, which has created a very safe route directly between Krasnoyarivka and Zelene Druhe, which improves the resupply capabilities of the Russians, but also allow them to cross over the Vovcha river line at the smallest crossing there is. This crossing here is at the widest, somewhere around 5 to 10 meters, and without even the physical crossings, the Russians can cross over with amphibious infantry fighting vehicles and personnel carriers. Therefore, the Russians would be able to storm across the river line, and the river line does not pose a significant challenge, and therefore Soriane would be in danger of the Russians storming them, which they currently are, reportedly. And then at the same time, we'd likely see operations towards Oleksandropil, potentially towards Vovchenka and Kruhlyakivka, as the Russians would look to gain control over the northern parts of Kurakhove, as literally running across the Vovcha river line and storming these settlements in the north is easier for the Russians to do than fight over Kurakhove, and taking control of these northern parts entirely would significantly improve the Russian ability to fight over Kurakhove. To the south of Maximilianivka, the Russians are advancing further along the highway. As we see with the analysis I did earlier, the Ukrainians would have to withdraw a significant portion of their forces, most importantly their FPV drone operators, towards Kruhlyakivka, and that would limit the range of their operators to not cover this area of the highway. This has left the area largely unprotected, and the Ukrainian positions here in the east are significantly vulnerable for further offensive operations by the Russians, and they've been able to secure the high ground near Maximilianivka. Therefore, the Russian positions by Maximilianivka has been secured almost entirely. They just lack this fortified position, which the Ukrainian FPV drone operators would likely be within range of. In the direction of Antonivka and Katerinivka, the Russians have advanced within the eastern parts of the settlement, expanding their foothold within the settlement, and the fighting continues in the central parts of it. So we see Katerinivka is being stormed from the east and southeast, although the southern parts remains in a gray zone, and Antonivka is entirely within Ukrainian control. The Russian operations continue here in Katerinivka. It's likely that, since considering the Russians have yet to storm Antonivka from the east, that the Russians may look to do a combined strike from the south and the east at the same time to gain control over both by the advantage gained in the south. Gain control over both would allow the Russians to start fighting over Yelisavetivka and Ilinka. We see Ilinka has fortified positions here in the northeast, and Yelisavetivka has the Slutka River here to the east. Therefore, it would be difficult for Russians to advance from Katerinivka, which is fairly isolated from the rest of the positions. This also means that Katerinivka likely has few defensive soldiers, vehicles, and so on. Instead, they would be more focused on having FPV drone operators in Yelisavetivka, Ilinka, and Snivka to cover for Katerinivka. In general, the Ukrainians are heavily reliant on FPV drone operators to hold back Russian offensive operations. However, this also means that the majority of the Russian losses are simply in vehicles and equipment rather than personnel. In general, we see that the Russians are advancing all across the front line. They are advancing slowly. They're taking more vehicle losses as they use more vehicles to launch these operations. And despite the rain starting to fall, and we are in late October, their vehicles are still able to advance on Ukrainian positions. There is no large Ukrainian minefields that the Russians have encountered yet either. That is due to the fact that the front line has rapidly moved behind the frontline positions, and the Russians have advanced significantly across the front line, which has led to the Ukrainians not being able to cover properly with mines and other defensive equipment as they withdraw, and this has led to the Russians being able to keep up their momentum on their advances. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.